There's something Father Amorth confided in me that completely changed my understanding of how to detect spiritual problems in families. He said, "For my first 20 years as an exorcist, I made the same mistake that 90% of Catholic families make. I looked for dramatic and obvious signs while completely ignoring the really important indicators. It wasn't until I analyzed thousands of cases that I realized the most devastating infestations always began with signs so subtle that families dismissed them as normal coincidences of life. This revelation led him to develop what he called spiritual differential diagnosis, a method to distinguish between normal everyday events and the early manifestations of negative influence that, if detected in time, could be prevented before becoming severe problems. The problem, he explained, is that families expect spiritual problems to announce themselves dramatically. They expect levitation, demonic voices, objects flying. But in my 70,000 cases, I've learned that these dramatic manifestations are like a high fever in medicine. They indicate the infection is already severely advanced. The true indicators of early diagnosis are far more subtle. He shared a medical analogy that helped me understand his approach. An experienced physician can detect cancer months before a patient feels obvious symptoms by observing subtle changes in blood tests, fatigue patterns, or minor alterations in appetite. Similarly, an experienced exorcist can detect spiritual infestation months before a family notices anything supernatural by observing subtle patterns in family dynamics, gradual changes in the atmosphere of the home, and almost imperceptible alterations in spiritual routines. What struck me most about this conversation was when he described specific cases where families had lived with signs of infestation for years, interpreting them as normal, difficult phases, until it finally escalated to such severe manifestations that intensive intervention was required. I remember a family who came to me after 5 years of bad luck, he told me. Constant minor accidents, recurring financial problems, family arguments that seemed to appear out of nowhere, mild but persistent illnesses. For years, they attributed all this to modern life. When they finally came to me, the situation had escalated to evident manifestations that required months of intensive work to resolve. But when I reviewed their history in detail, I could pinpoint the exact moment the infestation began 5 years earlier. They had introduced a specific object into their home that served as a point of entry. If they had recognized the early signs and removed that object immediately, all the subsequent suffering could have been avoided. This experience motivated him to systematically catalog the most common subtle signs that precede severe infestations. What he discovered was such a consistent pattern that he developed what he called an early detection protocol that can help any Catholic family identify spiritual problems in their early stages. The key, he explained, is to understand that negative spiritual forces prefer to operate on the periphery of human consciousness. They don't want to be detected until they've established enough influence to resist countermeasures. That's why the early signs are specifically designed to appear as normal coincidences. The first subtle sign that 90% of families ignore: gradual changes in the emotional atmosphere of the home that don't correspond to specific family events. This is the hardest to recognize because it's the most subtle, Amorth explained. Families who historically enjoyed being together gradually begin to feel slightly uncomfortable in their own home. There's no specific reason, it just doesn't feel as welcoming as before. He described how to detect this sign specifically. Observe if spontaneous family conversations have become less frequent for no apparent reason. If the children prefer to be in their rooms instead of the common area. If you yourself find excuses to stay away from home longer than necessary. If family celebrations feel slightly forced instead of naturally joyful, the crucial thing about this sign is that it occurs independently of real family problems. I'm not referring to tension caused by financial problems, marital conflicts, or job stress, he clarified. I'm referring to changes in the emotional atmosphere that have no explanation in external circumstances. He had documented this pattern in over 80% of cases of gradual infestation. Families retrospectively could always identify the moment when something changed in the feeling of their home, but at the time they attributed it to normal factors of life. Second sign, subtle but persistent interruptions in family spiritual routines that occur without a conscious decision to change them. This sign is particularly insidious because it disguises itself as natural evolution or lack of time, Amorth explained. Families who prayed together regularly gradually forget to do so. Children who previously enjoyed Bible stories suddenly find them boring. Adults who maintained personal prayer routines find that there's no time or that they feel distracted. The diagnostic key, according to Amorth, is the gradual and seemingly justified nature of these changes. If a family consciously decides to change their spiritual routines for specific reasons, that's different. But when established routines simply fade away without a deliberate decision, it frequently indicates subtle interference. He described the typical pattern. First, family prayer becomes irregular. We're too tired tonight. Then it becomes optional. Whoever wants to can pray individually. Finally, it disappears completely without anyone making a conscious decision to eliminate it. I've observed that negative influences specifically attack spiritual routines because these act as the family's immune system. Once they eliminate these natural defenses, they can establish influence more easily. Third sign, a subtle increase in negative coincidences that specifically affect activities or objects related to the Catholic faith. This sign requires careful observation because the individual coincidences seem completely normal, Amorth explained. A rosary that breaks could be natural deterioration. A crucifix that falls could be house vibration. But when multiple accidents specifically affect religious objects while leaving similar non-religious items untouched, it becomes a pattern that demands attention. Father Gabriele Amorth described specific examples he documented. Families where only Catholic books develop loose pages, where only religious images need repeated straightening, where only blessed candles inexplicably extinguish while others burn normally. He also included coincidences interfering with spiritual activities, phone calls interrupting specifically during family prayer, minor emergencies arising precisely when the family plans to attend Mass, mild illnesses affecting different family members precisely on days of obligation. The key, according to Amorth, is documenting these events to identify patterns. Individually, each incident has a perfectly reasonable explanation, but when you document them over weeks, a pattern frequently emerges where the coincidences disproportionately affect elements related to faith. Fourth sign, subtle shifts in sleep patterns, specifically affecting the ability to concentrate during spiritual activities. I'm not referring to general insomnia or sleep problems related to stress, Amorth clarified. I'm referring to specific patterns where people sleep a normal amount of hours but wake up feeling unrefreshed, especially before days when they've planned intensive spiritual activities. He described the typical pattern: families who sleep well most nights, but consistently experience restless sleep before spiritual retreats, fasting days, or when they've planned extended prayer sessions. It's as if something is specifically interfering with the rest needed for spiritual activities. This Also includes unsettling dreams that aren't outright nightmares, but leave a persistent feeling of unease. Dreams you can't clearly remember, but that leave you feeling spiritually dirty or discouraged upon waking. Dreams that seem normal, but inexplicably drain your energy for prayer or spiritual reading. Fifth sign, a gradual increase in susceptibility to temptations that weren't previously problematic for specific family members. This sign is particularly subtle because it disguises itself as growth or maturation, Amorth explained. Children who previously showed no interest in inappropriate content suddenly feel drawn to violent movies or music with vulgar lyrics. Adults who maintained clear moral standards gradually begin to make small exceptions. The diagnosis isn't the temptation itself. We all face temptations as a normal part of spiritual life. The diagnosis is a change in temptation patterns that doesn't correspond to natural circumstances of development or environment. He described specific examples. A teenager who for years had resisted peer pressure to experiment with alcohol suddenly develops intense curiosity. An adult who had maintained conservative entertainment habits gradually finds content attractive that they previously instinctively rejected. The key is to observe if these changes in susceptibility occur, gradually without a specific trigger, and if they concentrate on areas that previously represented spiritual strength for that person. Sixth sign, subtle but persistent interference in family communication, manifesting as heightened misunderstandings that escalate disproportionately. This sign is devastating because it erodes family unity in a way that seems entirely natural, Amorth explained. Words spoken with one intention are consistently misinterpreted by the listener. Neutral conversations escalate into arguments without anyone being able to explain exactly how it happened. He described the specific pattern. It starts with occasional misunderstandings that seem normal. Gradually, it becomes a pattern where positive communication requires significant conscious effort. And while negative interpretations arise automatically, this also includes interference in physical communication, text messages that don't arrive when they contain spiritual content, phone calls that cut off specifically during conversations about faith, important emails that go to spam folders without technical explanation. I've documented families where communication works perfectly for secular matters, but consistently fails when they try to coordinate spiritual activities or discuss faith-related topics. Seventh sign, gradual changes in the perception of time during specific spiritual activities. This is one of the most subtle, but also most revealing signs, Amorth confided. Spiritual activities that once felt fulfilling, where time flew by, gradually begin to feel interminable. 10 minutes of prayer feels like an hour-long mass feels like a marathon. Conversely, time spent on entertainment or secular activities seems to accelerate. Hours watching television feel like minutes, while half an hour of Bible reading feels eternal. He explained why this sign is so diagnostic. Negative influences try to make spiritual activities feel laborious, and worldly activities feel attractively efficient. It's subtle psychological warfare designed to gradually tilt preferences towards the secular. When families report to me that prayer has become boring or that Mass feels longer than before, I frequently discover it's not a problem with the activities themselves, but interference with their temporal perception during those activities. Eighth sign, an increase in minor emergencies that consistently interfere with family spiritual commitments. This sign perfectly disguises itself as busy modern life, Amorth explained, but when you document it carefully, you discover that the emergencies and urgencies arise disproportionately during times dedicated to spiritual activities. He described the pattern. a headache that appears exactly when the family plans to pray the rosary together, a homework problem that arises precisely during family Bible reading time, a work emergency requiring immediate attention just before leaving for Mass. Individually, each urgency is completely valid and justified. But when you document them over months, you frequently discover that 80% of interruptions to spiritual routines are caused by urgencies that could have been handled at other times. I've witnessed families where secular activities rarely get interrupted by emergencies, but spiritual practices consistently face interference from urgent situations, appearing at the last minute. After outlining these 8 subtle signs, Father Gabriele Amorth explained a specific protocol he'd developed to help families document and assess these patterns in their own lives. The key is objective documentation for at least 4 weeks, he explained. Many families think they can evaluate these patterns based on memory, but memory is selective and can be influenced by suggestion. The documentation method Father Amorth recommended, a simple family journal recording specific events daily in categories corresponding to the subtle signs he described. It's not about becoming obsessive or paranoid, he clarified. It's about developing objective awareness of patterns that might be going unnoticed. He described a specific format. Each day, dedicate 5 minutes to recording any event that corresponds to the categories we discussed. Interruptions to spiritual routines, significant family misunderstandings, coincidences affecting religious objects, shifts in perceptions of time during spiritual activities. After 4 weeks of documentation, review the records looking for patterns. If 50% or more of interruptions to spiritual activities are caused by last-minute urgencies, that suggests a pattern requiring attention. If family misunderstandings are concentrated specifically on conversations about faith, that's significant. He also explained how to distinguish between problematic patterns and normal variations in family life. Normal life includes occasional interruptions, periodic misunderstandings, and fluctuations in spiritual motivation, he said. What we're looking for are statistically significant deviations where problems concentrate specifically on faith-related areas, in a proportion exceeding normal variation. He also explained the specific signs indicating when these subtle patterns are beginning to escalate towards more severe manifestations, and what to do immediately when these escalation indicators are recognized. The advantage of detecting infestation in the early stages is that the required countermeasures are relatively simple, he told me. But if these subtle patterns are ignored for months, they eventually escalate to a level where much more intensive intervention is required. Escalation. Signs requiring immediate action? When the subtle patterns he described begin to affect multiple areas of family life simultaneously, and when the frequency of problematic events increases noticeably over a 2-week period. If a family is documenting these patterns and notices that instead of isolated events, they are now experiencing multiple categories of interference every day, that indicates the negative influence is gaining strength and seeking to establish a more dominant presence. Also, when children begin to consciously verbalize resistance to spiritual activities they previously enjoyed, especially if they use language that doesn't correspond to their normal vocabulary or developmental age. I've documented cases where children who previously loved Bible stories suddenly describe them as stupid or boring, using the exact same words, even though they live in different houses and haven't had contact with each other, he explained. That uniformity of language suggests an external influence that goes beyond natural development. When these escalation signs appear, Father Amorth had developed a specific early intervention protocol that can be implemented immediately, without needing consultation with ecclesiastical authorities, but should be escalated to professional help if it doesn't produce results within 2 weeks. Element 1 of the Early Intervention Protocol: a thorough spiritual audit of the home, including the identification and removal of any object that might be serving as a point of entry for negative influences. This audit must be systematic and thorough, he explained. Begin with obviously problematic objects, anything related to occultism, astrology, or New Age practices, but also examine seemingly innocuous objects that were acquired during periods of emotional vulnerability, or that were gifts from people whose spiritual beliefs are questionable. He described a specific method. Examine each room systematically, paying special attention to how you feel spiritually in the presence of different objects. During prayer, if certain objects generate a feeling of unease or distraction, consider them suspicious, regardless of their innocuous appearance. Also, remove any entertainment that normalizes violence, sexual immorality, or non-Christian supernatural elements. This includes music, movies, books, and video games that might be contributing to a gradual deterioration of the family's spiritual sensitivity. Element 2, intensive restoration of family spiritual routines, with a temporarily increased frequency to saturate the family environment with divine presence. When you detect early infestation, you need to consciously saturate your home with activities and symbols that invite divine presence so intensely that any subtle negative influence becomes uncomfortable and seeks a more hospitable environment, he explained. He described a specific program for 2 weeks, double all normal spiritual routines. If they prayed the rosary once a week, do it daily. If they read the Bible occasionally, dedicate specific time each day. If they attended Mass only on Sundays, add a weekday Mass when possible. Also, add sacred music in the background during normal household activities. Play Gregorian, chant or worship music while cooking, cleaning, or studying. This creates an environment where subtle influences find it more difficult to operate. Element 3. Strategic use of sacred objects specifically placed in areas where more interference has been observed. This isn't about superstition, Amorth clarified. It's about using sacramentals that the Church has specifically blessed for spiritual protection, placing them strategically where they're most needed. He explained specific placement: holy water at the thresholds of rooms where more family misunderstandings have occurred, crucifixes in areas where spiritual routines have been most interrupted, images of the Holy Family in spaces where the emotional atmosphere has deteriorated. Most noticeably, sprinkle blessed salt discreetly in corners of rooms where more problematic coincidences have occurred. The Catholic tradition recognizes blessed salt as particularly effective for purifying spaces. Element 4. Implementing strategic prayer times that specifically counteract the moments when more interference has been observed. If you've documented that interruptions to family spiritual life consistently occur at certain hours, schedule family prayer specifically during those periods to reclaim that time, he explained. If last-minute emergencies consistently interfere with weekend spiritual plans, establish a Friday night family prayer routine that pre-consecrates the weekend. If family misunderstandings are concentrated during dinners, begin each meal with a more elaborate prayer that includes a specific petition for harmonious communication. After explaining this early intervention protocol, Father Gabriele Amorth shared the most important information: how to assess whether these measures are working and when additional professional help is needed. If after 2 weeks of consistently implementing these measures, the problematic patterns continue or intensify, that indicates the situation is more advanced than it initially seemed and requires professional evaluation. he explained. But in the majority of cases I've documented, when families detect these subtle patterns early and implement appropriate countermeasures immediately, the situation resolves within the first 2 weeks. He described specific indicators of successful progress, a gradual return of a natural sense of comfort in the home, a decrease in the frequency of seemingly inexplicable family misunderstandings, a restoration of natural motivation for spiritual activities, a noticeable reduction in coincidences affecting religious objects. Also, changes in the perception of time during spiritual activities. Prayer begins to feel naturally fulfilling again, and Mass no longer feels interminable. But he emphasized that the goal isn't simply to eliminate the symptoms, but to develop increased sensitivity to recognize and prevent future attempts at subtle influence. Once a family has experienced these patterns, they become more vulnerable to future attempts, he explained. But they also become more capable of recognizing early signs and responding effectively before problematic patterns become established. He described what he called a preventative maintenance system that families should implement after resolving the initial situation. Monthly spiritual audits of the home, continued attention to the quality of the family's emotional atmosphere, occasional documentation during periods of stress or change to ensure that difficult circumstances aren't being exploited to reintroduce negative influences. Also, ongoing education of all family members about these subtle signs so that each person can contribute to early detection if problematic patterns begin to re-emerge. Finally, Father Gabriele Amorth shared his deepest reflection on why he had decided to develop this system for detecting subtle signs. During my early years as an exorcist, I focused entirely on severe cases requiring dramatic intervention, he confessed. But I gradually realized that for every family who came to me with obvious manifestations, there were probably dozens who were suffering from subtle influences that never escalated to the point where they would seek an exorcist's help. My responsibility wasn't just to help severe cases, but to develop tools that would allow ordinary families to protect themselves before problems became severe. He explained that he had come to understand that prevention was infinitely more important than cure. A family that can detect and resolve subtle influences in the early stages not only avoids significant suffering, but develops a spiritual immunity that protects them from future attacks. They also develop a deeper understanding of the reality of spiritual warfare in a way that strengthens their faith instead of creating fear. When you see that you have effective tools to protect your family, you feel empowered instead of vulnerable. This philosophy led him to dedicate his later years not only to individual cases of exorcism, but to the education of priests and families about the recognition and prevention of spiritual problems. My most important legacy isn't the dramatic exorcisms I performed, he told me, but the families who never needed an exorcism because they learned to recognize and prevent spiritual problems in their earliest stages. With that perspective, he asked me to emphasize certain points if I shared this information publicly. First, that the detection of these subtle signs shouldn't create paranoia or fear, he said. It should create informed awareness that allows families to protect themselves proactively. Second, that the vast majority of problems detected in the early stages are easily resolved with simple measures. They don't require dramatic intervention or professional help. Third, that developing sensitivity to these signs strengthens family, spiritual life in general, regardless of whether they ever face specific problems. And finally, that families who consistently implement these preventative practices rarely experience an escalation to severe problems because they have developed a robust spiritual immune system. The knowledge I've shared with you today represents decades of meticulous observation by the most experienced exorcist in modern history. It's not theory or speculation. It's practical intelligence developed through the analysis of thousands of real cases. If you recognize some of the subtle patterns I've described in your own family, don't panic. Early recognition is a gift that allows you to take preventative action before any potential problem becomes serious. If you don't recognize these patterns, use them as a framework for maintaining healthy awareness that can protect your family in the future. In any case, implementing the preventative practices I've described will strengthen your family's spiritual life, regardless of whether you face specific challenges. Father Gabriele Amorth dedicated his life to protecting families from forces that operate in the shadows. Now that knowledge is in your hands. Use it wisely to protect those you love, and share it responsibly with others who can benefit from this hard-earned wisdom. The spiritual battle is real, but you don't need to be a victim. With the right awareness and effective tools, you can maintain your home as a sanctuary of peace, where your family can flourish spiritually, without interference from influences that would prefer to remain unseen. It's a battle waged on the periphery of human consciousness, a subtle war fought not with dramatic displays of demonic power, but with insidious whispers and creeping doubts. Father Gabriele Amorth, a man who dedicated his life to this unseen conflict, has warned us time and again about this silent invasion. These aren't the levitations, the demonic voices, the objects flying across the room that immediately scream demon. No, this is far more dangerous. This is the slow, insidious rot that eats away at faith, at family, at the very soul of your home. Think of it like cancer. You don't always notice it right away. It starts with subtle changes, a persistent cough, unexplained fatigue. Then the symptoms become more pronounced until it's too late. Similarly, spiritual infestation often begins subtly, a gradual erosion of spiritual routines. Perhaps family prayer becomes irregular. Bible stories are no longer a cherished part of bedtime. Little negative coincidences start to pile up, seemingly insignificant, yet they chip away at faith. This is where Father Amorth's expertise is so crucial. He understood the importance of spiritual differential diagnosis, the ability to discern between normal coincidences of life and truly important indicators. He emphasized the significance of what he called a spiritual early detection protocol, a keen awareness of the shifting emotional atmosphere within the home. Are there more arguments than usual? Is there a growing tension caused by financial problems, marital conflicts, or job stress? Is the house vibration, the overall feeling, off? These seemingly small cracks in the foundation of family life, these subtle but persistent interruptions in family spiritual routines, can be early warning signs. The point of entry is often overlooked. It might be a seemingly innocent object, an antique, a piece of art, something that brings a negative energy into your home. Or maybe it's connected to a lapse in protection, a period of weakness in the family's spiritual immune system. This is why strengthening your spiritual defenses, your family's shared faith, and your unwavering commitment to spiritual practices is of utmost importance. It's about building a strong immune system against these unseen threats. It is about creating a spiritual fortress capable of withstanding the relentless attacks of the unseen. The power of early recognition is now in your hands. The question is, what are you going to do with it?